Now I just want to talk a little bit about Visio and how you can actually design workflows with Visio, but you can't complete them. And you can also use the Visio add-in. Well, if you have Visio installed, you can see a graphical view of your workflow in SharePoint Designer. So, but you need to have Visio 2013 Professional installed. And to create a workflow with Visio, you have to use the Microsoft SharePoint workflow template. And you go to a flowchart, and then the shapes correspond to the conditions and actions. And then what you do is you save your Visio file, and then you import that. When you're in SharePoint Designer, you just import that so you can actually configure the actions and then publish the workflow. What we'll do now is use Visio to modify the design of a workflow. I have SharePoint Designer opened up, and right now we're going to look at using SharePoint Designer with Visio 2013 Professional. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into Workflows, and I'm going to open up one of the workflows that we worked on, the Set Pricing Level demo. And I'll edit the workflow. And I'm going to go back to Text-Based Designer. I had just opened this with Visio, but before, notice how before, let me go ahead and save this. And let's close this again and open it up. Just want to show you from the beginning before I practice using Visio with this. So right now, this is how we left this workflow in one of our demos that we did earlier in this chapter. So notice how the views used to say Text-Based Designer and Visual Designer. If we clicked on Visual Designer before, we got a message just saying that Visio 2013 Professional was not installed. Well, now it is installed. So right now we're still in the Text-Based Designer, but what we could do now that we have Visio installed is we could actually change the default view to be Visual Designer. And so you can see it actually fires up Visio inside of SharePoint Designer, and you can see our workflow now represented as a Visio drawing. And so you could go ahead and save that as an image. To me, that's really useful, especially for documentation. If you want to, you could save this off, or you could actually export it. So you could actually go ahead and say, let's say for example you wanted to work with it inside of Visio and you didn't want to have SharePoint Designer opened up. Well, you can do that too. We could just save this off. I'll close. Let me change the view back to Text-Based Designer. I'll close that workflow out. I'll just close SharePoint Designer, and then I'll go into my documents, and we'll just open up the VSDX file, the Visio file. And you can see here now we have all the shapes, the whole flowchart, the way it was designed in SharePoint Designer, and then we can add things to it. So we could change this to maybe, we'll just say set a workflow value, something like that. And here we could say let's just say if a value guess we can't change the text, but I think you get the idea. So you can come in here and start changing. I'm not going to go into using Visio here too much, but you could, if you wanted to, start from Visio. So you could actually drop quick shapes in here. So here's the stencils for SharePoint 2013 workflow for conditions, and then containers and terminators. So you can see here, this is the start stencil. That's the end of workflow stencil, or end of actually go to stage stencil, because you can see it right here, we're transitioning stages. And then our, let's see what else we have, the actual stage is represented by this. So you can see and then there's some actions. So set workflow variable. You can see that action stencil right here, down here, set workflow variable. So I'm going to go ahead and just save this. And if I wanted to, I could actually go back into SharePoint Designer and I could import that. You can import a VSDX file, and then from there you could add all the necessary functionality to it to make it a real workflow from a drawing. So I could go into workflows and I could import from Visio. So I could import a Visio 2013 diagram, and I would just call it, well, I could leave it this title. So what I'll do is rename this. Let's go into settings. Save that. Close that out, and then we can import. Okay, well, I'll just go ahead and overwrite it. That's fine. So now you can see we have the workflow here, and I could go back to text-based designer. What's happened there is the file that SharePoint Designer generates is just XAML, which is just XML, and Visio, that VSDX file, that's just XML too. So what's happened is that when we saved this to Visio, it retained all that metadata about the workflow. So that's why I was asking if I wanted to overwrite the existing workflow, because it already had all that data, all that metadata maintained. And so I'm able to switch between the text view and the Visio view, because the underlying data is pretty much the same. It's all XML. It's just a different format. One's XAML and the other one is the format expected by Microsoft Visio for Office for XML. So it's kind of nice. You can import something from Visio, or you can export to Visio, or you can kind of take a look at your workflow while you're working on SharePoint Designer to see the workflow shapes. And to me, what I think is kind of interesting is that you can actually use it for documentation. So if you have a kind of a complex workflow, and before, all you would have is just the text in SharePoint Designer, well, now you can actually use that to generate documentation. So you can create a nice Visio diagram from your workflow, and like they say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So it makes it a lot easier to describe your workflow to other people when they see it in the form of a Visio flowchart.